Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I was volunteering with a local historical society that maintained old cemeteries in our area. Oak Grove Cemetery was one of the bigger ones, tucked behind a line of oak trees at the end of a quiet road. It had been in use since the 1800s, with weathered headstones leaning at odd angles and family plots bordered by rusty iron fences. In October, especially the last couple of weeks before Halloween, we tried to make it look decent. People visited more around that time. History buffs, families, the occasional thrill seekers. So we spent a few weekends cleaning, mowing, trimming back the ivy, and repairing broken stones where we could. That year, I offered to help with some after-hours work because the regular crew was short on people. I didn't mind late nights, and the cemetery was familiar to me. I'd walked its paths countless times during the day. I knew where the uneven ground was, where the big mausoleums were, and which lights stayed on through the night. There was a caretaker's shack near the main gate, a small wooden building with a single room for tools, a counter, a desk, and a heavy lantern that hung from a chain in the ceiling. That shack also had the main lock for the gate and the power box for the security lights. On the night this happened, it was late October. The day crew had done their work earlier, and I came in around 10 p.m. to finish clearing out a pile of branches and scrap wood near the north fence line. It was a cold night but clear, no wind, just the quiet of late autumn. The cemetery at night is a strange kind of quiet. Even if there are houses not far away, the trees and the old brick wall around the property keep out most sound. You can hear your footsteps echo. The crunch of gravel under boots carries a long way. I worked steadily for a few hours. The small floodlight on the caretaker's shack lit the immediate area, and there were several motion-activated security lights placed around the perimeter. I kept a flashlight on me, but I didn't need it much. Around midnight, a few deer wandered in from the woods, moving between the stones like shadows. I'd seen them before. They didn't spook me. The only time the place ever gave me pause was when fog rolled in off the nearby creek. But that night, the air was dry and cold. Perfectly still. I lost track of time, as I usually did when working alone. I remember glancing at my phone once and seeing it was 1:47 a.m. I figured I'd pack up at 2 o'clock, lock the shack, and head home. By then, all the tools were back in place and the piles were moved. I did a last slow walk toward the north fence, just to check everything looked right. That part of the cemetery doesn't get many visitors. It's older, with family plots that haven't been tended in decades. A few headstones had collapsed completely into the ground. Some were barely legible. The security light on that end was mounted to a tall metal pole. Normally it just stayed solid when triggered, but as I glanced over that way, I noticed it flickering. At first, I thought it was just a bad bulb, but as I watched, the flicker wasn't random. It was steady. 2 quick flashes, a pause, then 3 flashes, then a longer pause, then it repeated. I stood there a moment trying to figure it out. Maybe a sensor issue, or a loose wire reacting to some interference. I'd never seen it do that before. It almost looked like a pattern, like a code. But that thought passed quickly. It was probably something simple, I told myself. I decided to walk toward it, just to take a closer look. It wasn't far. Maybe a 3-minute walk across the gravel path that looped around the grounds. The light from the shack grew dimmer behind me as I moved toward the north fence, and the shadows between the headstones thickened. My boots crunched steadily on the gravel, and every sound felt louder than it should have been. The air felt colder over there too, away from the light. I kept my hands in my jacket pockets to stay warm. Halfway there, maybe 50 feet from the flickering pole, I heard it, clear as day. The sound of gravel crunching directly behind me. Not echoing, not distant. It was right behind me, like someone had stepped onto the path I'd just walked. It wasn't one small sound either. It was a sequence, like someone taking a couple of deliberate steps. I froze mid-stride and turned around fast. The caretaker's shack was in view from where I stood. Its light cast a weak cone across the entrance area, but beyond that was just darkness between the graves. What made my stomach tighten was the shack door. I had locked that door maybe a minute earlier. I was sure of it. I always checked twice before walking away. But now the door was wide open, not halfway, not swinging. It was fully open, the dark interior visible even from where I stood. I started walking back quickly, my heart thumping harder than before. I didn't run, but my pace picked up. As I got closer to the shack, I saw something inside that made the hair on my arms stand up. The heavy lantern that hung from a chain in the middle of the ceiling was swinging hard, like someone had brushed past it. It wasn't the slow drift of a breeze. It was swinging side to side in wide arcs. There was no wind at all that night. None. The trees around the shack stood still. For a few seconds, I just stood there at the doorway, breathing slowly, trying to make sense of it. I knew that door had been locked. The latch made a loud metallic click when you turned the key. There was only one key, which I had in my jacket pocket. No one else was supposed to be there that night. The crew had finished hours ago, and the gate at the road was locked too. The only way in would have been to climb over the stone wall or the fence at the back, which wasn't easy. I stepped inside slowly, shining my flashlight across the room. Everything was where it should have been. The tools on the racks, the broom against the corner, the counter clear. No signs of someone rummaging. The only thing out of place was the door and that lantern still swinging. I held it to steady it, and it was cold to the touch, colder than the air around it. It took a solid minute for it to slow down completely. The padlock on the door hung from the outside hasp. It wasn't broken. It was just unlocked. I checked my pocket and the key was still there. That made less sense than anything else. If someone had somehow opened it, they'd have to have picked the lock fast and silent. If it had come undone by itself, that would mean the latch had failed completely, but it wasn't damaged. Click shut fine when I tested it again. I stood there with the door in my hand, flashlight beam cutting across the empty yard, feeling like the entire cemetery had shifted in some quiet way while I wasn't looking. I considered the possibility that someone was out there messing with me. Teenagers sometimes sneaked into Oak Grove around Halloween, though it wasn't common since the wall and fences went up. But if someone had slipped in, they were either extremely quiet or they were already inside when I arrived, waiting. That thought sat wrong with me. I didn't see any fresh footprints on the path when I turned my light down toward the gravel, though my own were all over the place by then, which made it hard to tell. I thought about going toward the north fence again, but my gut told me to wrap up and get out. It wasn't panic exactly. It was the sense that something wasn't adding up. A locked door standing open, a lantern swinging hard, a light flickering in a steady pattern at the far end of the property, all after hours in a place surrounded by walls and fences. If it was a person, they were either very prepared or very determined to stay hidden. I shut the door again and made absolutely sure the lock clicked into place. I tugged on it twice. Then I turned off the shack light and started walking toward the main gate where my car was parked on the other side. The motion lights along the path came on one by one as I passed, their white glow casting sharp shadows between the graves. Every sound I made echoed. I kept glancing over my shoulder more than usual. When I reached my car, I didn't linger. I drove home and sat in my driveway for a good 10 minutes, replaying what had happened. It didn't feel supernatural. It felt human, which somehow made it worse. Someone had either been in that shack or near it without making a sound, and they'd left no clear trace. The next morning, I went back with 2 other volunteers during daylight. We checked the door, the lock, the area around the shack. Everything was as it should be. The light by the north fence was still flickering in that same pattern. One of the guys climbed up the pole with a ladder and checked the fixture. The bulb was fine, and when we cut power to reset it, the pattern stopped. Later, when it came back on, it stayed solid. No one could explain why it had been flashing like that in a rhythm. The caretaker, who'd worked there for years, told us that door had never just popped open before. He said the lock was replaced only a few months prior. He checked it himself and said there was no damage, no sign of tampering. The chain on the lantern showed no sign of wear either. It was just as it had been. I didn't stay late after that. We finished cleanup for the season during daylight hours. Whatever had happened that night stayed with me. Not as a ghost story, but as a reminder that being alone in a large, quiet place at night leaves you vulnerable in ways you don't always consider. Someone could have slipped in and out without leaving a trace. Maybe they were watching me. Maybe they were planning something and changed their mind when I turned around. I'll never know for sure, but I'll never forget that moment standing on the gravel path, hearing footsteps right behind me, turning around, and seeing that door open like it had never been locked at all. I had gone to visit my grandmother's grave that evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the air had that early autumn chill that seeps into your bones. The cemetery was quiet, almost eerily so, but not in a way that felt wrong. It was always peaceful here, especially late in the day. I parked near the entrance, the gravel crunching softly under my tires, and grabbed the small bouquet I had brought. Walking through the winding paths lined with oaks and maples, I could feel the weight of the year settling in around me. The smell of damp earth and fallen leaves was strong, mixing with the faint odor of the aging stone markers that stood like silent sentinels around me. I reached my grandmother's grave, a modest marble headstone slightly weathered from decades of rain and snow. I knelt down, arranging the flowers carefully, brushing off the thin layer of dust and fallen leaves. There was a stillness here that I always appreciated, a moment to think, to remember. I stayed longer than usual that night, letting the silence stretch, my thoughts wandering through old memories, her laugh, the way she used to insist I try every odd vegetable from her garden, the soft rasp of her voice when she read to me as a child. By the time I stood to leave, the sky was fully dark, though the low amber lights along the main paths cast a dim glow that made navigation possible. I had taken the same route to the exit countless times, yet that night, everything seemed a little sharper, a little quieter. That's when I noticed it. A white utility van, faded and grimy, parked between two mausoleums at the far side of the cemetery. Its windows were painted over, completely opaque, and it didn't look like it belonged there. As I walked past it, the driver's side door creaked open slightly, then shut again, the sound unnervingly deliberate, like someone testing it, waiting to see if anyone was paying attention. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a worker or someone doing maintenance. Still, the unease lingered as I walked to my car and pulled out onto the main road, glancing in the rearview mirror. The van was there, rolling slowly out of its spot, moving toward me at a crawl. My pulse picked up. I couldn't see anyone inside, just that blank painted-over glass, but I could feel eyes on me, or at least the idea of them. I slowed slightly, testing the road, trying to see if it would turn off. When I reached a fork in the cemetery path, I made a wrong turn intentionally, doubling back to see if it was following me. It was, no hesitation, no turning away. The van mirrored my movement exactly. Panic started creeping in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled onto the main road again, checking my mirrors, trying to judge the distance. The van followed silently, no lights on. No sound of an engine beyond the faint hum you could hear through the tires on asphalt. Every instinct in me screamed to drive faster, but I didn't want to attract attention or make a mistake in the dark. I tried to think rationally. It could be someone lost, someone sneaking around the cemetery who didn't want to be seen. Maybe a caretaker had parked temporarily, but the way it had followed my movements precisely, the hesitation and testing of the door, it was deliberate. My mind ran through scenarios, each more unsettling than the last. The main road stretched ahead, lined with overgrown hedges and trees whose branches clawed at the edges of the road. I noticed how quiet it had become, too quiet. Usually you could hear distant traffic, maybe a dog barking in the distance or the occasional coyote calling. That night, the only sound was the faint rush of my own tires and the rhythmic hum of the van behind me. I turned onto a side street, hoping to lose it, winding through the neighborhood adjacent to the cemetery. Still, there it was, creeping along as if synchronized to my movements. I checked every rearview mirror I had, trying to catch a glimpse of a face, but the windows were perfectly opaque, painted white. Whoever or whatever was inside was concealed completely. The idea of calling the police crossed my mind, but I hesitated. What would I say? That a van was following me silently with no lights on after I left a cemetery? Would they take it seriously? My phone sat in my lap ready to dial, but my fingers froze as the van mimicked every turn I made. I realized then that it had been watching the cemetery entrance all along, waiting for someone to leave. I decided to test it one last time. I made a series of erratic turns, doubling back, stopping at street corners, and even driving slowly down alleys to see if it would continue following. It did. Every movement I made, it mirrored with that same slow, deliberate precision. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Sweat formed at my temples, not just from fear, but from the adrenaline trying to keep my mind sharp. Finally, I made a sharp turn onto the main road that led away from the cemetery and toward the highway. Drove a little faster but not recklessly, hoping that if it really was following me, it would either show its hand or give up. About a mile down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and it was gone. No van, no trace of it. The streetlights revealed only the empty asphalt behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit area, the familiar signs of gas stations and convenience stores giving me some small sense of safety. Even then, I stayed alert, scanning every side street, every parking lot. The van never appeared again. The next day, I went back to the cemetery during daylight hours to speak to the staff. I described the vehicle, the timing, and how it had followed me. The caretaker's expression darkened and he nodded slowly. He told me that several reports had come in over the past few months about the same van, always appearing near closing time, always following people as they left, and always disappearing without a trace once they were out of the cemetery. No one had ever caught anyone inside it, and no authorities had been able to track it down. Walking among the gravestones that day, I couldn't shake the memory of that silent, shadowy van. It had felt deliberate, methodical, and patient, as if someone or something was studying the patterns of people leaving the cemetery. I replayed the moment the driver's door had opened, the sound of it testing the space, and I realized that whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. It hadn't rushed, it hadn't made a noise beyond what it wanted me to hear, and it hadn't needed to. From that day on, whenever I visit the cemetery, I make sure to leave with others or during the busier hours of the day. I check my mirrors obsessively, scanning for any signs of that van. Sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees and the shadows lengthen, I think I can hear the faint hum of tires on asphalt, slow and deliberate, as if it's still out there somewhere, waiting, just beyond the edge of sight. Even months later, the memory of it hasn't faded. The van wasn't supernatural, and there were no ghosts involved. It was entirely human, entirely real, but that made it far more unsettling. Someone had watched, waited, and followed without warning. The emptiness behind the painted windows, the silence, the precision of its movement, all of it was terrifying because it could happen to anyone, anywhere. And the truth is, it could happen again. My cousin and I started photographing old headstones when we were in our early 20s. It wasn't some ghost hunting hobby or anything like that. We were both into genealogy. Our grandmother had boxes of old family records, but a lot of the dates were half missing or written down wrong. It turned into a little project for us. On weekends, we'd drive out to rural cemeteries and take clear, labeled photos to upload to online archives. It was quiet work, but there was something peaceful about walking through these forgotten graveyards at sunset, with only the sound of birds settling in for the night. One cemetery we visited often was Maple Hollow, a small tree-lined plot about 15 minutes outside town. It sat on a slight hill behind an old white church, surrounded by farmland on 3 sides, and a thin tree line on the 4th. It wasn't big, Maybe 200 headstones, most from the late 1800s and early 1900s. The place never felt spooky to me, just quiet and still. The caretaker was an older man named Harold, who lived in a trailer nearby and kept the grass short even in winter. One evening in late October, just before sunset, my cousin and I were walking through Maple Hollow taking our last batch of photos for the day. The light was fading fast, that kind of cold orange that makes shadows stretch out longer than they really are. We were working near the back fence when we noticed something odd. In the far corner, where the ground sloped down toward the tree line, there was a single grave with a bunch of bright, fresh flowers placed neatly in a vase. The rest of the cemetery was bare, except for a few plastic arrangements that had been faded and cracked by sun. These flowers looked like they'd been bought that morning. Fresh tulips, even though it was almost November. We both found it strange, but what made it stick in my mind was how that same grave always had fresh flowers. We'd been visiting for months, through the tail end of summer and into early fall. Even on cold mornings when frost coated the grass, there'd be new flowers in that vase. At first, we figured someone still cared for the person buried there, a spouse or maybe a child. But when I casually mentioned it to Harold one afternoon, he shook his head. He told me no family had visited that plot in years. He knew most of the regulars who maintained graves. That one, he said, was a mystery. The grave belonged to a woman named Alice May Parker. The headstone was modest. Gray granite, her name, birth, and death dates, and a simple carving of a cross. She died in 1972. There were no other Parker family plots around it. Just hers, tucked in the corner like she'd been placed there almost as an afterthought. The flowers kept coming, even in dead winter. Fresh, not fake. Always replaced regularly. After a while, it got under my skin. It wasn't like I thought anything supernatural was going on. It just didn't add up. This was a small town. People noticed things. Someone had to be visiting, and they were doing it consistently enough that we never caught them. My cousin and I joked about it at first, but eventually we decided we'd figure it out. It became a little mystery to solve. One Friday night in mid-November, we decided to stake it out. The cemetery technically closed at sunset, but no one really enforced that rule. Harold went to bed early and never locked the gate. We figured the best way to catch whoever was leaving the flowers was to park nearby and wait. If nothing happened, no harm done. If someone showed up, we'd at least see them. We picked a spot under a line of oak trees on the gravel road that ran along the cemetery's western fence. My truck was old but reliable, with dark tinted windows that made it hard to see inside at night. We parked around 10 p.m., cut the lights, and sat in the dark. It was cold enough that you could see your breath inside the cab, so we kept the engine off and bundled in jackets, passing a thermos of coffee back and forth. The cemetery at night didn't feel scary, exactly, but it was unsettling in a different way. Without the hum of daytime, the silence pressed in from all sides. You could hear the faint rustle of dry leaves moving across the grass and the occasional distant dog barking from one of the nearby farms. The church was just a dark silhouette against the cloudy sky. A half moon hung low, lighting the tops of the stones in a dull silver glow. The only artificial light came from a single sodium lamp near the caretaker's shed, casting a weak orange pool that didn't quite reach the far corner where Alice's grave sat. We waited for a while. 10:30 passed, then 11 We were both getting stiff from sitting still in the cold. My cousin started yawning, but neither of us suggested leaving. Then at 11:30 on the dot, something happened. From down the road, I saw headlights flick off. A car, dark-colored, maybe a sedan, rolled slowly toward the gate with its lights out. It wasn't speeding or swerving, just moving like whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. It turned into the narrow gravel path inside the cemetery, moving smoothly over the bumps like someone who'd done it before. The vehicle stopped near the middle of the cemetery, about 50 feet from Alice's grave. A tall figure got out. The interior light of the car never came on, and it was too dark to make out his face, but I could see his outline clearly. He wore a long hooded coat, maybe a raincoat or a hoodie, and he moved with a kind of quiet purpose, no hesitation. He walked straight toward Alice's grave, not even glancing around like someone worried about being seen. He carried something in one hand. We watched in total silence. He reached the grave, crouched down, and placed a bouquet of fresh flowers in the vase. Then he stood up and just stayed there, motionless. I don't know how long exactly, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5, but it felt longer in the cold night air. His posture didn't suggest mourning exactly. It was too still, almost rigid. Then, without looking back at the car, he turned and walked toward the tree line at the back of the cemetery. The direction he went was straight into the woods, not toward any road or house. It was thick, uneven ground back there, no paths I knew of. We expected to see him circle back eventually, but he didn't. We waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15, no sign of movement. No crunch of leaves, no flashlight beam, nothing. I turned the key in the ignition just enough to check the time. 12:08. His car was still there, or at least it had been. When I finally glanced back toward the middle of the cemetery, the car was gone. No sound of an engine starting, no headlights, just gone. That didn't make sense. The only way out was the gravel road we'd been parked along. We would have seen headlights or at least heard tires crunching on the gravel. But there'd been nothing. The car had vanished and the man hadn't returned. We debated what to do. My cousin wanted to drive in and check the grave. I wasn't eager to spook whoever might still be out there. But after another 15 minutes with no sign of movement, curiosity won out. I started the truck and eased through the open gate, headlights off. The gravel crunched loudly in the quiet. We rolled to a stop near Alice's grave. The flowers were fresh, like brand new. Dew still clung to the petals even though it was close to freezing. There were no footprints I could see from inside the truck, but the ground was hard and dry. I got out and checked the vase. It wasn't some cheap grocery store bouquet. These flowers looked professionally arranged, the stems trimmed evenly, tied with a small piece of white ribbon. Whoever placed them there took care in doing it. The woods behind the grave were pitch dark. The moonlight barely touched the first row of trees, and beyond that, it was a wall of black. I listened hard, trying to pick up any noise, but all I heard was my own breath. The sense that someone was still out there watching us settled into my stomach like a weight. After a minute, I got back in the truck, locked the doors, and we drove off. The next day, we came back around noon. The flowers looked exactly the same, fresh like they'd just been placed that morning. There was no sign of any car tracks except the ones we'd made. I checked the perimeter fence to see if there were any gaps someone could have walked through, but aside from a few spots where the wire sagged, it was intact. We started checking every Friday night after that. We'd park in different spots, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Every single time around 11:30 or so, that same car showed up with its headlights off. Sometimes it was closer to 11:40 once it was almost midnight, but it always came. The same tall man in the hood, the same silent walk to the grave, the same fresh flowers placed carefully in the vase, and every time he disappeared into the woods afterward. We never once saw him return to the car, and yet somehow the car would be gone minutes later. It became almost routine. But the more we watched, the more uncomfortable it felt. At first, it had been curiosity. After a few weeks, it turned into something heavier. There was no fear exactly. Nothing threatening had happened. But the sheer regularity of it, the precision, started to feel less like someone visiting a grave and more like some kind of ritual. We started noticing small details. The flowers were always the same type. Tulips, red and white, wrapped in plain paper with no note. The man never lingered less than 3 minutes or more than 5. He never looked around. He never brought anything else. Always the same. In mid-December, a light snow fell one Friday evening. We were excited because we figured this would be the night we'd finally catch some clear tracks. We parked in our usual spot and waited. At 11:33, the car rolled in again, lights off, leaving perfect tire tracks in the fresh powder. The man got out, placed the flowers, and vanished into the woods like before. We waited 20 minutes, 30, no return. When we finally drove in, the flowers were there. Dew turned to tiny beads of frost. The tire tracks from the car led in from the gate, stopped near the middle of the cemetery, and then nothing, no exit tracks. Just clean snow behind the car's stopping point, like it had driven in and evaporated. We got out and walked the perimeter with flashlights, checking for fresh footprints or tire marks that might indicate a second exit. The only human tracks belonged to us. His footprints from the car to the grave were faint but visible. Then they ended abruptly at the edge of the woods. No return prints. We pushed a little way into the trees, but the snow back there was untouched. It was as if he'd walked in and never come out. That night stuck with me more than any other. Wasn't supernatural. I don't believe that. But it was deeply unsettling. There was a man, a real man, visiting a grave every Friday night, rain or snow, with surgical precision, and somehow leaving without leaving any trace. There had to be some explanation. Maybe he lived on the far side of the woods and walked home through some path we couldn't see. Maybe there was a second vehicle parked somewhere beyond the tree line. But even those explanations didn't fully sit right. After the holidays, my cousin lost interest. He said we'd gotten our answer. Some guy was visiting the grave regularly, end of story. But I couldn't let it go. I started coming alone on Friday nights, parking in different places, even walking in from the opposite side of the woods one evening to see if I could catch him from behind. Every time, same routine. Car in, flowers down. Walk into woods, car gone. Nothing else. In February, I decided to check public records. I found Alice May Parker's obituary in an old newspaper. She'd been a school teacher, never married, no children listed. She died young, only 34. The obituary was short, no surviving family mentioned. Her parents had passed years before her. There were no records of anyone being buried nearby who might be a close relative. No public records of property owned behind the cemetery either. Nothing obvious that tied her to anyone still living. Eventually, I stopped going. Not because anything happened, but because nothing did. The man kept coming week after week like clockwork, and I realized that if he'd been doing this for years, long enough for Harold to say no one visited, he wasn't going to stop. He clearly didn't want to be seen or bothered. Whatever story lay behind those flowers in that grave, it belonged to him and Alice, not to me. The last time I checked was in early spring, just before dusk. The tulips were there, fresh as always. A little ribbon tied around the stems. I stood by the grave for a long time, looking at the name carved into the stone, trying to imagine the life of a woman who died 50 years ago, and the man who kept her memory alive every single week without fail. I didn't figure it out, but I also didn't need to. It wasn't a mystery that wanted solving. It was just a quiet ritual, done by someone who cared in his own way, hidden in the shadows of a small cemetery. And after months of watching, I finally let it go. I was working the overnight shift for a private security company that patrolled the cemetery grounds, a sprawling place that stretched for what felt like miles on the outskirts of town. My job was mostly mundane, making sure kids didn't sneak in to hang out, checking the perimeter gates, and keeping an eye out for vandals. Most nights were quiet. The moon would hang over the grounds, sometimes hidden behind clouds, and the trees would creak in the wind while I drove slowly along the cracked asphalt paths. I'd roll the windows down to listen to the night, the only sounds being the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves under the paws of a raccoon. That night, it was mid-January, bitterly cold, the frost crunching under my boots. I parked my patrol truck under a large maple tree near the veterans section. The branches were bare, skeletal against the faint glow of streetlights from the road outside the cemetery. I kept my flashlight on the dashboard, and the heater hummed softly, trying to keep the chill out. I had the radio on, mostly static, just so there wasn't complete silence. Around 1:15 a.m., I was reviewing my route, making a note of a few areas that had a history of kids climbing over the fence when I heard it. At first, I thought it was a branch falling, or maybe a deer knocking against a headstone. But the sound was deliberate, rhythmic tapping like fingernails on stone. Slow, measured, methodical. It came from a spot just beyond the veterans section. A flat marble headstone I recognized because the name on it was worn but still legible. I froze for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself it was an animal. I leaned out of the truck slightly, shining my flashlight toward the source. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the rows of headstones, the frost glinting faintly on their surfaces. When it landed on the flat marble slab, the tapping stopped immediately. Nothing moved. The wind seemed to carry the sounds of the distant town behind the cemetery walls, but in the cemetery itself, it was dead silent again. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching over frost-bitten grass. The air smelled sharp and clean, but there was an underlying dampness that carried through the night. My flashlight beam danced across the headstones, and I kept circling the slab, trying to see if anything could have made that sound. There was nothing. No branches were broken, no fallen stones. The ground was frozen solid. I crouched down, shining the light directly on the marble. Tiny scratches marked the surface, faint, shallow lines that didn't seem old, not like the other weathered marks from years of exposure. They looked deliberate, as if someone had dragged their fingernails across the stone. I straightened up, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe a kid had sneaked in earlier, carving into the stone, and I hadn't noticed. But the pattern of the tapping, the regular rhythm, didn't fit with a careless scratch. I started walking back toward my truck to finish the patrol, the flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. That's when it started again. This time it was louder, faster, and coming from two different headstones at once. One was the marble slab I had just examined, the other a small granite marker a few yards away. My stomach tightened. I stopped, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The tapping wasn't random. It was almost like a code. Each tap deliberate, each pause measured. My mind raced through possibilities. Kids, raccoons, maybe some kind of vandal. But none of them made sense. The cemetery gates were locked at sunset. The ground was frozen. Climbing around that area without leaving prints would have been almost impossible. I decided to leave that section and continue my patrol elsewhere. The truck felt miles away. Each step I took seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the cold night. The tapping moved with me. Every time I turned my head or aimed the flashlight toward a different path, I could hear it, faster and closer. I started walking faster, my breath coming out in white puffs. The beams of my flashlight swept over the headstones, the frost, the skeletal trees, but nothing was there. When I finally got back to the truck, I jumped inside and locked the doors. The tapping stopped instantly, leaving only the low hum of the heater and the faint static on the radio. My hands were shaking as I restarted the truck, circling slowly along the main paths but avoiding that veteran section entirely. I kept the windows up, the heater on full, and the flashlight on the dashboard. The rest of the night, I stuck to areas closer to the entrance, keeping an eye on the perimeter, avoiding any secluded sections. Every shadow seemed to move differently than it should. Every branch that swayed made me tense. I kept glancing at the veterans section through the rearview mirror. Nothing moved, but the memory of the tapping lingered. Insistent and precise. The next morning, my supervisor showed up around 6:30 a.m. We did our usual walkthrough after the night shift, checking gates, locks, and patrol logs. He was a quiet man, mid-40s, someone who had seen plenty of strange things in the cemetery over the years, but not prone to superstition. I hesitated, then told him about the tapping and what I had found on the marble slab. He didn't laugh or brush it off. Instead, he followed me back to the veterans section. That's when he noticed something I hadn't fully processed in the daylight. On the marble slab and the granite marker nearby, tiny, clean gouges marked the surface. They weren't deep, but they were precise, like fingernails had dragged deliberately across the stone, leaving sharp little lines that hadn't been there the day before. The frost had preserved them overnight. My supervisor knelt down, brushing his hand lightly across one of the gouges. He frowned, the lines catching in the morning sun. "I've never seen that before," he said quietly. "Looks like it was done with hands, fingers." We walked the rest of the veterans section, checking the ground, the surrounding trees, and other headstones. There were no footprints in the frost leading to or from the stones. Nothing suggested anyone had been there. The ground was still frozen solid, and any attempt to climb the headstones would have been nearly impossible without leaving marks elsewhere. We reported it to the police as a precaution, mostly out of procedure. They came during the day, looked around, checked for signs of forced entry or vandalism, but they found nothing. No footprints, no tools, no evidence of anyone having been there. They left after a few hours, noting it as unusual but inconclusive. After that night, I requested a permanent reassignment away from the veterans section. I didn't want to patrol that area anymore, not after what I heard and saw. The tapping never happened again while I was working, but I couldn't shake the memory of it. It wasn't random. It wasn't natural. The precision of the sounds, the timing, the fact that they stopped when I shined the light. It was deliberate. Months later, I ran into another security guard who had started working there. He mentioned the veterans section again. A few other night guards had reported hearing tapping at different times. Sometimes it was on the same marble slab, sometimes on different headstones. The gouges appeared, vanished, or multiplied, but always without explanation. Nobody could find any evidence of trespassers. It was just happening. I never went back to that cemetery at night after my reassignment. Even in the daytime, I kept my distance from the veterans section. The memory of those rhythmic taps echoing in my mind every time I passed the gates. I still think about it sometimes. The feeling of standing there, flashlight in hand, hearing the tapping start again right behind me, knowing I couldn't see the source, and realizing the ground and the headstones were too solid and frozen for anyone to have made it physically possible. It wasn't ghosts or spirits, not the way stories describe. It was something else, something I couldn't explain, and in a place that was supposed to be quiet, respectful and still, it reminded me that even the most ordinary, rigid surfaces, the marble, the granite, the frozen earth, can hide movements and intentions we aren't prepared to understand. That's what stayed with me long after the gouges were cleaned off. Long after my patrols moved elsewhere. Even now, years later, whenever I pass by a cemetery, I notice the flat, smooth headstones first, imagining what it would feel like to hear that slow, deliberate tapping start up again right behind me, while the night is perfectly still. After the first heavy snowfall of the season, everything outside looked like it had been wrapped in white silk. The roads were slick but passable, the streetlights glinting off the frozen surfaces, and the cemetery on the outskirts of town looked untouched, peaceful in a way that made it almost eerie. I was driving past at midnight, the road nearly empty, when something caught my eye. From the edge of the pavement into the cemetery, there was a trail of footprints, barefoot prints, deeply pressed into the fresh snow, leading straight toward the heart of the graveyard. My curiosity overpowered the logical part of my brain that was telling me to stay in my warm car. I parked along the shoulder, the engine's hum fading into silence, and grabbed my flashlight. The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped out. The cold hit me immediately, sharper than the air usually felt. I crouched to examine the footprints. They were clearly human, adult-sized, and there was no other disturbance around them. I glanced around. No tire tracks, no other footprints, nothing. It was as if someone had appeared, walked in a straight line across the cemetery, and then vanished. I followed the trail, feeling a mix of unease and fascination. The snow was deep, and my boots sank a little with each step. I passed headstones that glinted under my flashlight. Some small, some ornate with weathered marble angels and stone crosses. The prints continued between the graves, moving methodically, straight as an arrow. I realized that at some points, the path passed uncomfortably close to grave sites. I had to step carefully to avoid brushing against the cold stone. The farther I walked, the more I noticed details that unsettled me. The snow was entirely undisturbed except for the footprints. No animal tracks, no fallen branches, nothing. The cemetery had large, old trees, their limbs coated in heavy snow. Every step made a soft, muffled cracking sound under the snow, echoing in the stillness. My flashlight's beam flickered occasionally, dimming for brief moments even though I had fresh batteries, which made me glance around nervously. I reached a point in the cemetery's center where the footprints simply stopped. The snow was pristine beyond that spot, not a single disturbance. No indication of where the person had gone, whether they'd sat or knelt. Nothing. Just empty snow stretching between rows of graves. I crouched down again, trying to see if there was any hidden trail, some faint mark, anything that might indicate what had happened. There was nothing. A creeping chill ran through me. The stillness of the air pressed in around me, heavier than it should have been. I had the sense of being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. My pulse quickened. I glanced back at the direction I had come from and noticed something that made me freeze. There were new footprints, fresh and clear, that hadn't been there before. They ran alongside mine, following the exact path I had taken. Barefoot, just like the others. I swallowed hard and started walking back toward my car, trying to remain calm. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the cold open air. The snow crunched beneath my boots, but there was no sound of another person walking besides the faintly visible prints. I kept my flashlight raised, shining it back toward the trail, but the snow reflected the light in a way that made the shadows sharp and deep. The new footprints kept pace with me, never straying, never disappearing. My mind raced. I thought about calling someone, maybe the police, but my phone was buried in my coat, and I didn't want to turn my back fully on the prints. I decided to keep moving slowly, deliberately toward the road. Halfway back, I realized I could hear faint sounds over the snow. Not footsteps, not at first, but a soft scraping, like someone dragging something lightly over the surface. My heart thumped painfully in my chest. I didn't run. Running felt instinctively dangerous in this situation, as if any sudden movement might trigger something unseen. Instead, I kept walking, eyes scanning the snow for movement. But there was nothing, just the footprints, silent and persistent, keeping pace with me. By the time I reached the edge of the cemetery nearest the road, I could see my car. The headlights weren't on, which was good. I paused, catching my breath, glancing back again. The new footprints had stopped at the cemetery's edge, right where the trees gave way to the road. I didn't see anyone. No signs of movement, no footprints leading past mine or leaving the cemetery. Nothing. I got in my car, started the engine, and stayed there for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The snow had begun falling lightly again, soft flakes drifting down, muffling the world even further. I waited, listening. There was nothing. No sounds of footsteps, no rustling in the trees, nothing. Finally, I eased the car onto the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I pulled away. The cemetery receded behind me, quiet, frozen, untouched again. But in the mirror, I thought I saw a faint shape standing at the cemetery's edge, just beyond where the footprints had ended. It was dark, almost blending into the trees, unmoving. I blinked, and it was gone. I drove the rest of the way home without incident, but the image of the barefoot footprints stayed with me. I checked local news, police reports. Nothing about trespassers or vandalism in the cemetery. No one was reported missing. The whole situation made no sense. The next morning, I drove back during daylight to look. The footprints were gone, melted into fresh snow from the overnight flurry. There was no sign of disturbance at the cemetery's edge. No dragged marks, no hidden paths. Everything looked as untouched as it had the night before. The trail had vanished completely, leaving only the memory of it in my mind. It never made sense, but one thing was clear. Something had been there. Something had followed me silently, kept pace with every step, and left no trace behind. The feeling that someone or something was observing, measuring me, lingered long after I left the cemetery. I've never gone back at night, and I don't intend to. Even in daylight, the snow might hide nothing, but the memory of those footprints and the weight of that still, frozen air remains with me. I learned that some paths should never be followed, and some quiet nights are quiet for a reason. Even now, when the first snow falls and the world goes silent, I can't help glancing toward that cemetery. I can still imagine the faint, precise impressions in the snow and the eerie way they mirrored my own steps. The thought of them following me again makes my stomach tighten, and I know I'll never walk that path in the dark a second time. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to remind you to stay away. I had never done anything like this before, but the idea of urban exploring a cemetery in the dead of winter felt like a challenge we couldn't pass up. It was just past 11 p.m., the kind of late where the town felt completely asleep, the streets empty, and the air carrying a wet, frozen smell that hinted at the snow melting and refreezing. The sky was black, a heavy cloud cover making the moon invisible, leaving only the occasional streetlight glow through the gaps in the clouds. My two friends and I had parked a few blocks away, and we were crouched behind a chain-link fence, eyeing the narrow iron gate at the back of St. Paul's Cemetery. Everyone in town said it stayed locked after sunset, but the gate stood slightly ajar, rust eating at the hinges and iron posts. It looked too easy, too inviting. I felt the cold bite through my jacket as I pushed the gate open, the sound of metal scraping on metal, echoing faintly into the night. My boots crunched on the frozen dirt path inside, and the air smelled sharp, like frost mixed with rotting leaves and wet soil. The cemetery was larger than I had expected. There were narrow paths lined with cracked headstones, some leaning at impossible angles, snow crusted on their surfaces, and the occasional evergreen casting shadows that seemed far too dark for what little light there was. At first, the three of us moved quietly, stepping over uneven ground, careful not to trip on roots or old tombstones. The sound of our boots against the frozen earth seemed unnaturally loud, and I could feel my heartbeat picking up, pounding in my ears. My flashlight beam cut across names and dates from the 1800s and early 1900s. Some were barely legible, worn by decades of wind and rain. Others sharp and clear, almost defying the years. I had thought it would feel creepy, maybe eerie, but at that moment it felt quiet, almost peaceful. We wandered toward the middle of the cemetery, passing by family plots with iron fences around them. Snow had drifted into the corners, collecting in the shapes of crosses and angels. My friend Mark ran his hand over one of the taller headstones, brushing off the snow to read the engraving. I stayed back, feeling the cold through my gloves, my flashlight flicking slightly in my hands. After a few minutes, I noticed that the air seemed to change, almost imperceptibly at first. There was a shift in the soundscape. The night wasn't just quiet. It was silent. Not like a normal silence, but like the world had sucked all sound into itself, leaving just us and the crunch of our boots. I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker that didn't belong to the tree shadows. I shook it off, assuming it was a trick of the light, or maybe the cloud cover making the moon move behind it. We continued exploring, passing crypts that looked older than the town itself, their doors warped and rusted shut. One particularly large crypt had a broken top stone, and the snow had drifted inside like powdered sugar. Mark tried to lift a stone off the ground, revealing a small hollow beneath it, but it was empty. We laughed nervously, the sound almost startling in the stillness. After wandering for maybe 20 minutes, we decided it was time to head back. The night air had gotten colder, our fingers numb despite gloves, breath forming clouds in front of our faces. When we reached the iron gate we had entered through, I felt my stomach drop. The gate was no longer just closed. It was chained shut, a thick silver padlock gleaming faintly in the flashlight beam. The chain looked new, no rust or wear, and tight enough that there was no way to slip it off without tools we didn't have. I rattled the gate, testing it, hoping it was just jammed. My friends did the same, and when nothing budged, I realized the reality of the situation. We were trapped. The other gates were on the far side of the cemetery, several acres away, and the paths were unfamiliar in the darkness. The thought hit me suddenly. Someone had been watching us, had noticed us coming in, and had locked us in. My hand shook, not just from the cold now. We tried calling out, our voices muffled in the thick frozen air, but there was no response. No distant sound of a car engine, no dog barking, nothing. Just the echo of our own voices bouncing weakly off the tombstones. Phones came out, flashlights flicking on, but one by one each flashlight died. Not a slow dimming, not a battery drain. They cut out instantly, the screens going black despite full charge. Mark's flashlight did it first and mine followed immediately. Then my third friend's. We were in complete darkness. For the next 2 hours we stumbled through the cemetery, feeling our way past stones, tripping over roots, slipping on patches of ice. The snow muffled our movements but didn't hide the crunch when we fell. Every few steps I would hear something. A shift behind a tombstone, a brush of movement, the snap of a small branch. Each time I shined my dead flashlight, there was nothing, but the feeling never left. My pulse was racing, cold seeping into my bones, and I could hear Mark muttering under his breath, frustrated, scared. We tried to find another exit. The cemetery was enormous, the paths twisting back on themselves. I remembered seeing a small shed by the caretaker's house when we had walked in, but that was too far in the opposite direction from where we wanted to go. We kept walking, sticking close together, stepping over snow-covered graves, my mind racing with possibilities. Every time we thought we saw an opening, the ground shifted, the shadows moved, and we ended up back where we started. Finally, exhausted, numb, and desperate, we decided to scale the fence. It wasn't high, but the cold made our hands clumsy, frostbites starting to form on our fingers. We tested the fence and one by one began climbing. My friend was halfway over when suddenly, motion lights flicked on from behind the caretaker's house. We froze. The harsh white light cut across the cemetery, illuminating rows of graves, the tops of crypts, and finally the edge of the fence. Someone had been watching. They were inside, hidden by the building, waiting. I couldn't see them clearly, only a shadow moving behind the light. Panic surged. My hand slipped on the icy metal and I nearly fell back, but I kept climbing. We made it over the fence, landing hard on the other side, snow and mud coating our clothes. Breathing heavily, we ran, our boots slapping against the frozen ground. The lights now behind us chasing shadows we couldn't define. When we finally reached the street and the safety of a lit sidewalk, the panic didn't stop. We didn't look back until we were several blocks away. The cemetery behind us silent again. The gate locked. Nothing out of place except for the memory of being watched. We didn't speak about it for months after. There was no sign of tampering, no trace of the chain or padlock if anyone went back the next day. Phones worked fine again. Flashlights functioned normally. But every time I pass St. Paul's Cemetery now, even in daylight, I notice the back gate and imagine the watchful eyes behind it. The experience left something behind, a sense of being seen, tracked, a reality that doesn't vanish simply because the lights come back on. Even now, when I think about it, the memory makes my fingers cold, makes my pulse quicken. I know exactly where I was, exactly how the shadows moved, exactly how it felt to be trapped, alone in the middle of a frozen cemetery with no way out except the unknown. I used to deliver flowers for funerals, a job that paid well enough and allowed me to spend a lot of time outdoors. Most days it was simple. Pull up to the gravesite, set the arrangements, and leave. I got used to the quiet, the sense of stillness that came with these places. But one afternoon, a delivery changed that. I was assigned a family plot near the oldest section of Highland Park Cemetery. The area was different from the more recent sections, which were neat and orderly. Here the stones were weathered, some tilting at odd angles, with names almost worn away by decades of rain and snow. Moss and lichen covered everything, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and decay. It was late afternoon, sunlight filtering weakly through a line of skeletal trees, their branches stripped bare for winter. I had my box of arrangements strapped into the back of the van and walked down the narrow gravel paths between rows of graves, trying to make sure I didn't step on any stones. Most people stayed near the paved sections closer to the entrance, but I had to go deeper, where the older plots were. The family requested something modest, simple lilies for a crypt tucked into a corner where a small grove of oaks leaned over. As I rounded a corner, my attention caught something out of place. A stone crypt door, one of the older sealed types that were supposed to be impossible to open without heavy tools, was wide open. I stopped dead. These doors were usually set with concrete and steel, and I had seen them on dozens of deliveries. They weren't like a coffin lying exposed. They were meant to keep whatever was inside untouched for decades. Yet this one stood ajar, the cold shadow inside spilling out onto the path. My first thought was that someone had vandalized it. I hesitated at the edge, taking a step closer to peer inside. The interior was surprisingly small, just enough for a coffin and maybe a few belongings. But what drew my attention was the evidence of someone living there. A rough sleeping bag was crumpled on the floor, surrounded by a few empty cans and a small old camp lantern that was still warm. The faint smell of smoke and metal hung in the air, along with the musty odor of old stone. Someone had been inside very recently. I swallowed hard, unsure if I should leave or investigate further. I set the flowers down on the path for a moment and crouched near the door, careful not to step on the threshold. The lantern flickered slightly when I nudged it with my finger. I felt an immediate sense of unease. Cemeteries were supposed to be places of quiet mourning, not makeshift homes. I glanced around the surrounding area. No one in sight, just the skeletal trees swaying slightly in the wind, casting long shadows over the graves. I couldn't ignore it. I had to let someone know, so I walked back toward the main road, where the groundskeeper usually sat in his small shack near the old chapel. He was an older man, pale skin like parchment, thin and bent slightly from years of carrying tools and shovels around the cemetery. I told him about the open crypt and he sighed deeply. He explained that this wasn't the first time. For months, someone had been sneaking into the older tombs, mostly in the winter when the grounds were empty, staying inside until just before sunrise, then disappearing without a trace. They had never caught him despite the caretaker's efforts. Security cameras were nearly useless in that section. The trees blocked the view, and the stone structures created blind spots. The idea of someone living undetected in those crypts made a chill run down my spine. I went back to the family plot with a lighter sense of attention. Every shadow seemed longer, every rustle of the trees sharper than usual. I set the flowers carefully inside the crypt they had requested, and left quickly, trying not to look back at the open crypt I had seen earlier. But it lingered in my mind, the thought of someone sleeping just a few feet from graves, surrounded by death for hours at a time. The next few weeks I kept thinking about it. Every time I had another delivery in that area, I scanned the tombs more carefully, looking for signs of someone else's presence. Trash, footprints in the mud, lanterns, even the faint smell of smoke. Sometimes I found evidence, a crumpled blanket here, a boot print there. Other times nothing. Whoever it was had learned to blend in perfectly, moving silently, avoiding detection. One night I was finishing up a delivery near the older section when the wind picked up. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the faint smell of frost on leaves and the sharp tang of wet stone. I had parked on the gravel path, adjusting a bouquet in the back seat, when I noticed a shadow moving between the graves ahead. At first I thought it was a deer or a stray dog, but the shape was upright, human-like, moving with a cautious, deliberate pace. I froze. The figure paused near a crypt I hadn't seen opened before, crouched briefly, then disappeared behind the row of stones. My first instinct was to drive away, but I felt a compulsive curiosity. I walked slowly toward the row, keeping my headlights off, heart hammering. There was no one there now, but the ground was soft from recent rain, and I saw the prints immediately, barefoot, leading to the crypt and stopping midway. No footprints leading away, no disturbance in the grass. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. I reported the incident to the groundskeeper the next morning. He nodded grimly, unsurprised, and reminded me that these people, or this person, were careful, patient, and familiar with the old layout. The police couldn't do much. Trespassing on private property without evidence of theft or violence was a gray area, and there were no witnesses. I realized then that the cemetery itself had become part of the pattern. its twisting paths and concealed corners offering cover for someone who knew it well. From then on, I kept a wary eye whenever I delivered to that section. I started arriving earlier, making my rounds before sunset and leaving as soon as possible. But even in broad daylight, the open crypts and traces of someone else's presence weighed on me. Every time I passed one of the older tombs, I imagined someone inside huddled in a sleeping bag, listening to the crunch of my boots on gravel, watching and waiting. The final time I saw signs of the intruder was one winter afternoon. Snow had fallen the night before, covering every grave and path with a fresh layer of white. I arrived at a crypt to place a bouquet of white chrysanthemums and noticed footprints in the snow leading from the road into the cemetery. They were small, barefoot, precise, and went straight to a crypt. I followed them cautiously, each step sinking slightly into the snow, and saw the same lantern, now cold and unlit, beside a neatly folded blanket. Whoever had been here had left recently, but nothing indicated where they went. No tracks leaving the area, no discarded cans, nothing but the deep, untouched snow beyond the crypt. I stepped back, heart pounding, realizing that I had been glimpsing a secret world that existed alongside the normal cemetery life. Someone living among the dead, unseen, moving through the shadows and vanishing without a trace. I left the flowers, locked up my van, and walked away, knowing I would never stop thinking about it. That crypt, the empty sleeping bag, and the faint smell of smoke stayed with me for weeks. A reminder that some parts of the world existed just out of sight, in places most people thought were quiet and safe. I never saw the intruder again. But every time I delivered to the old sections of Highland Park, I passed by the crypts with a careful glance, half expecting to see a blanket move or a shadow shift. It's a strange, unnerving feeling, realizing someone can hide in plain sight among the graves, and it makes every visit there a little heavier, a little colder. The cemetery has always been full of the dead, but that day I realized it also holds the living, in ways you never expect. I was taking my usual shortcut through the old Pioneer Cemetery on the west edge of town when I noticed it. The path wasn't official, just a dirt trail that cut between leaning gravestones and patches of overgrown grass. Locals had used it for decades to shave off a good 10 minutes between the edge of town and the main road. During the day, the place felt quiet, but not creepy. The stones were weathered and cracked, many from the 1800s. Most people avoided it at night, but I'd walked it plenty of times in daylight without a second thought. It was late afternoon, just before sunset. The light was low and golden, filtering through the trees and casting long, stretched shadows. Halfway through the cemetery, something off to my right caught my eye. At first, it was subtle, a patch of dirt that didn't match the rest. I stopped and stepped closer. It was a clean rectangle, about 3 feet by 6, with soil that looked freshly turned. The edges were unnaturally straight, almost like it had been dug with a shovel and refilled carefully. There was no headstone or marker anywhere near it, just bare dirt in an otherwise untouched part of the cemetery. I crouched down and studied it more closely. The surrounding ground was firm and packed, but this patch was loose and dark, with faint shovel blade marks still visible along one side. I picked up a broken stick and pushed it gently into the edge. It slid down far easier than it should have, well past a foot with almost no resistance. The moment I pulled it back, the smell hit me. Thick, sweet, and rotten. The kind of smell that makes your stomach tighten before your brain even processes what it is. I staggered back a step, covering my nose with my arm. It wasn't just decomposing leaves or wet dirt. It was the unmistakable scent of something dead. I looked around, but the place was completely empty. No fresh flowers, no signs of recent maintenance. The smell lingered in the air, heavy and wrong. I'd walked through this cemetery dozens of times and never smelled anything like it. I didn't stick around. I walked out fast, cutting straight to the sheriff's office, which was only a few blocks away. I told them what I found and gave clear directions. They took it seriously, probably because of the smell, and said they'd send someone to check it out. That night, I couldn't shake the image of that neat rectangle of soil. I'd never seen a fresh grave in that place before. The cemetery hadn't been used for burials in decades. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I walked near the cemetery again in the afternoon and saw 2 sheriff's trucks and a small team roping off the area. A blue tarp was spread out nearby, and a couple of men were digging carefully. I stayed behind the fence far enough to not interfere, but close enough to see they were taking it seriously. They worked slowly, removing dirt in layers. By evening, word had already spread through town. They had found a freshly buried dog carcass wrapped in a tarp in that exact spot. But that wasn't the end of it. When they kept digging, they found human remains buried underneath the dog, recent remains. The cemetery wasn't supposed to have any new burials, which meant someone had used it to hide something. Over the next few days, the place turned into a full crime scene. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs to search the rest of the cemetery. The sheriff's office taped off large sections and brought in state investigators. People gathered at the fence, whispering and speculating. It wasn't long before they discovered more shallow graves in the far corner. 2 more, each with human remains. All of them recent. All buried quietly in a place nobody really visited after dark. It turned out someone had been using the cemetery at night to hide evidence. It made sense when you thought about it. The place was unlit, remote enough to be dark after sunset, with broken fences and no patrols. Nobody monitored it. A person could drive up, dig, bury something, and leave without anyone noticing. The dog on top was a decoy. If anyone found disturbed soil, they'd likely find the animal and dismiss it as someone burying a pet illegally. Nobody was supposed to dig deeper. Eventually, the sheriff's office caught the man responsible. He was a local contractor with a history of odd jobs and a connection to a few missing persons cases. They caught him through a mix of tips, vehicle, evidence, and the fact that someone had noticed a pickup idling near the cemetery late at night, more than once. The bodies matched several missing people reports from the past year. For weeks afterward, I couldn't walk past that place without picturing that moment. The stick sinking too deep, the smell rising from the earth. I'd use that path like it was nothing, never realizing what might have been buried a few feet from where I stepped. They fenced off the cemetery after the investigation, added cameras and motion lights, and banned people from cutting through. My shortcut was gone, and I didn't miss it. It wasn't ghosts or legends hiding in that cemetery. It was just someone taking advantage of a forgotten place, trusting that nobody paid enough attention. I just happened to notice a patch of dirt that didn't belong, and that small detail cracked open something much darker than I expected.